Well, Pam asked me to talk about endocrine disruptors and birth defects, and I prepared a great talk on endocrine disruptors and birth defects. And then I got an email from her yesterday morning, and the email had some data about birth defects in Alaska, and it turned out that what I had prepared was not really what is most interesting. So you're going to get a change of what I originally prepared, and if it doesn't all flow together too well, it's her fault. But I think it may actually be more interesting. Birth defects from endocrine disruptors is usually considered to be birth defects of the male and female reproductive system. I don't mean to imply that these are unimportant, but I think we're talking about endocrine disruptors in a broader sense, and so that's really what I want to deal with. All right, so the first thing is what caused birth defects? Well, certainly there's an important role for genetics. We know that because mutations will increase the risk of birth defects. We know a lot about some vitamins. For example, folate is very important for normal development of the brain, and anencephaly, think Zika virus, infections can also cause birth defects. Mutagenic chemicals, anything that causes cancer is likely also to cause birth defects. Excessive alcohol and tobacco use are well known to cause birth defects, and certainly endocrine disruptive chemicals. Again, we think of birth defects of the male and female reproductive system. But this is birth defects in Alaska compared to the rest of the US. And if you look at that list, birth defects of the male and female reproductive system are not high on the list. What is high is birth defects of the cardiovascular system. And I must say, well, I know a lot of chemicals that increase risk of birth defects of the cardiovascular system, and many of those chemicals are endocrine disruptors. I'm not sure that I would say that the action whereby they cause birth defects of the cardiovascular system is due to endocrine disruption. And then this looks at Alaska Native versus Alaska non-natives. And what you see is this very striking elevation in Alaska Natives of birth defects of the cardiovascular system. And I've only had 24 hours to try to understand why that would be the case, and I haven't come up with an answer. But I think this is a very important observation as we look at Alaska, which as a state has a very high incidence of birth defects, but it's disproportionately high in Alaska Native populations. Now, it's also high for birth defects of the gastrointestinal system. It's not elevated in Alaska Natives for birth defects of the urogenital system. So, and that's one of the reasons why I'm still going to show some of the slides I had about birth defects of male and female reproductive organs. I think maybe that's a little bit off the subject that we should be concerned about here. So what are birth defects of endocrine disruptive systems? Well, there are effects on the male. That's primarily undescended testes. Hypospadias is when the ureter exits the body along the shaft of the penis and not at the tip. Malformations of the urethra and the scrotum. And then in the females, physical defects in the structure and positioning of the uterus. Also, there's a lot of evidence that exposure to either estrogenic or androgenic chemicals can alter the ratio of male to female births. In general, there's about 51% male births, 49% females. Males are the fragile sex, and so we have to have a few more so we can survive. That's the normal thing. In many exposed populations, for example, Cerveso, Italy, with dioxin exposure, there were no male births in the center areas for several years, and the ratio has been demonstrated to be abnormal in other exposed populations. Well, what do we mean by birth defects? And this goes to sort of what you just heard from Carol and what we're talking about in general about endocrine disruption. You can have a birth defect that isn't reflected at birth, but occurs years later. And that may be in the form of altered fertility, reduced fertility. In males, reduced sperm counts. We know that's very well documented, both in animals and humans, after exposure to endocrine disruptors. Now, what remains to be clearly identified is that a result of prenatal exposure or postnatal exposure. And I don't think we know the answer. I suspect it's some of both. Small testes, disruptive sex-specific play behavior. Wonderful studies from the Netherlands that looked at dioxin and PCB-exposed children where the mothers were exposed and found the little boys preferred to play with dolls and the little girls preferred to play with guns. Is that a disease? No, it's not a disease, but it's a perturbation of normal biology. And then in females, again, reduced fertility, alteration in age of puberty. For most organics that have estrogenic activity, puberty at an earlier age. Again, is that a disease? No, it's not a disease, but it's a perturbation of normal development and is associated with some psychological impacts as well. Abnormal menstrual cycles, I'll talk a little more later about some of our studies on that, and again, disrupted play behavior. Now, in terms of major birth defects, neurotube defects are really very important. They're one of the most common birth defects. Everyone's aware of Zika and what that's doing for microcephaly or anencephaly, but there's a lot of evidence that dioxins, PCBs, PAHs, chlorinated pesticides increase the risk of neurotube defects, which is anencephaly, cleft lip, cleft palate, spina bifida. Now, are those through endocrine disruptive actions? I don't think so, but these are endocrine disruptive chemicals. And that makes another important point that I want to make, that just because a chemical has endocrine disruptive activities doesn't mean it doesn't have a dozen other activities. And so we've got to get past the point thinking that every bad chemical only does one bad thing or operates only through one bad mechanism, because that simply is not true. Multiple birth defects and reduced birth weight are found in almost every country where it's been studied, just in people living near hazardous waste sites. And usually those hazardous waste sites contain all sorts of nasty chemicals. Some of them are endocrine disruptive, some of them are not. And we've seen this through fish consumption, that contaminated fish consumption increases the risk of increased birth defects. And these contaminated fish usually are, the contaminants are ones that have endocrine disruptive activity, but all of the birth defects are not necessarily those that we could attribute to the endocrine disruptive activity. All right, and this leads to what Carol was saying, because, well, birth defects imply exposure before birth. There are a lot of diseases for which we now know that early life exposure increases the risk in late life. And that includes obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension. Again, the question of how much prenatal exposure is responsible and how much postnatal exposure is responsible is a major question. I'll go on and show you some of our evidence. This is just a figure on prenatal PCB exposure and increased BMI, so obesity. And it's interesting that in this study, which was published in 2014, overweight women, their offspring showed a striking relationship in obesity in the child as a function of their PCB concentration, but that was not seen in women of normal weight. Now, is this genetic? Is it passing on PCBs to the child? Is it epigenetic? Those are questions that remain to be answered. There's a lot of data in this slide, but only look under PCBs, the second line down. This is a study looking at maternal exposure to PCBs, DDE and DDT, and obesity in the first 6.5 years of life in their children. And there's a whole pile of evidence now that maternal exposure to various contaminants increases the risk of childhood obesity. There are a lot of confounders, what the diet is and everything. I wrote a wonderful grant to study this. It didn't get funded, but That's the way it is with some of the best grants I've ever written. Let me tell you about some of the studies we've done that are relevant to this. Now, they're not really relevant to birth defects, but they're relevant to these multi-health effects of various contaminants. For the last 30 years, I've worked with the Mohawk Nation at Akwesasne at the New York-Canadian border. And we've studied, we've taken blood samples, we've gotten medical histories, drug histories, pharmaceutical history, and we've taken bloods for clinical chemistries for PCBs and 3 pesticides. This population has a high rate of obesity, and when we looked at the association by tertile of PCBs and DDE, we found strong associations, strong elevations in obesity, in diabetes, in relation to their current serum PCB level. The next question, though, was PCBs are a mixture of 209 different chemicals, and they don't all act exactly the same. So our most recent study was which of those PCBs are really responsible? And I don't have time to show all of the results, but let me show you the results in the punchline. PCBs contain anywhere from 1 chlorine to 10 chlorines. Those PCBs that only have a few chlorines are actually relatively rapidly metabolized in our body, but they're also much more water soluble and much more volatile than those that have a lot of chlorines. So if you ate a contaminated fish for dinner last night, you got those PCBs with a lot of chlorines. And they're going to stay in your body for a long time, and that's what most of us have been measuring all these years. But if you look at this plot, the association with diabetes was 5-fold for PCBs that had no more than 4 chlorines. Now, these are not the ones that are very persistent. These are the ones that volatilize and go into the air, and you breathe them 24/7, because we all breathe, as we just heard this noon, all the time. There was no significant association with all of the other PCBs. Now, DDE, which in the previous slide showed this looked like a 6-fold elevation in risk of diabetes, when you look at the congener profile, no association whatsoever. This implies that in our Mohawk population, breathing the air and the PCBs that are in the air is what is increasing the risk of diabetes. Now, some of those PCBs are dioxin-like, and everybody knows a lot about dioxin-like things because they've been around for a long time. We've had methods for studying them, and most people have discounted any non-dioxin-like health effects of PCBs. What we find is that the dioxin-like PCBs have no relation to diabetes. And if we look at the non-dioxin-like PCBs that have 4 chlorines or less, by tertile, among our Mohawk population, adjusting for age, sex, BMI, the people with the highest 3rd level of PCBs have a 7.5-fold increased risk of diabetes. Now, the significance of those results are that breathing the air that contains PCBs is very dangerous to your health. And we have a second study that I won't show you the details of, but in the same population, my colleagues Mia Gallo and Larry Schell have looked at altered menstrual cycles in young women of reproductive age. And they find the same association, that the higher the PCB level, the more irregularity in the menstrual cycle, and at the highest level, a total failure to ovulate. But that association only applies to the PCBs with few chlorines, PCBs that are in the air and are breathed in. Now, let me quickly talk about one other population, and in this population we haven't looked at those issues of which congeners are important. But another disease that hardly anyone thinks about as being related to environmental exposure is high blood pressure. So this is a population of about half black, half white people living in Anniston, Alabama, around the plant that manufactured PCBs. They never worked there for the most part, but they were exposed just by living close to it. So we got measurements of PCBs by CDC, which doesn't monitor most of these lower chlorinated congeners. And we took, we got, again, demographic and drug mixtures, the drugs people took, and 3 measures of blood pressure. And this is what we found. The red dots are systolic blood pressure, the black dots are diastolic blood pressure. What you see there is a significant linear relation between blood pressure and your serum PCB levels. Now the dashed lines show the boundaries traditionally set for being hypertensive. And you see, well, again, pay only attention to the second column on your right, but by tertile, there is greater than 5-fold increase of having both systolic and diastolic hypertension if your PCBs are in the top tertile in this population. And as I showed you in that previous slide, even in the range of normal blood pressure, your PCB level is influencing your blood pressure. Well, I think the one really important insight for me is this issue of inhalation of PCBs. And let me expand a little bit about the other implications of that. For a number of years, I've looked at diseases people have if they live near a hazardous waste site. We have a good listing of hazardous waste sites in New York. We also have a good registry. So if you go into the hospital when you're discharged, that hospital must report to the state health department every disease you have. We find living near a waste site that has PCBs increases the risk of diabetes, of hypertension, of cardiovascular disease, of stroke, of asthma, of respiratory infections. Almost all the things you've heard about today, of COPD. Now, just living by a waste site, what's the route of exposure? It's got to be inhalation. So what our studies with the Mohawks confirms is, yes, inhalation of PCBs increases risk of diabetes. What about inhalation of PCBs for all of us in our environment? Well, there's an enormous amount of interest right now in PCBs in schools. And PCBs were used as a solvent for caulk that was put around the windows in almost every building constructed before 1975. And 75% of the schools in New York City have PCB-containing caulk. We've had major issues in Hartford, in Malibu, California. PCBs, in addition to the diseases I've mentioned, reduce IQ. And they are as effective as lead in reducing IQ. The last thing you want to have in a school is kids breathing the air that's going to reduce IQ. But it isn't just the schools. It's every home, every office building, every academic center that was constructed in that period likely has PCBs volatilizing off this old caulk and everybody in the room breathing it. So we have not at all solved this problem. It's very expensive to remediate these buildings, and for the most part, that's not being done. So that's not a happy story, but the conclusion is it's dangerous to live near a hazardous waste site that contains PCBs. It's dangerous to be in a building and breathe the air that contains PCBs. And I don't see any major solution in the short term. Thank you, and I'm sorry to leave you with such a pessimistic message.